We're now going to look at a very basic setup that we can use with the controls, and this is the setup that I really like, especially for FK controls. And it fits into the general concept of having as little of an interface for a rig as possible. Essentially, we want to be able to have as many controls as possible, but we want to have as few of these in the interface as possible so that the animator can focus on the character and not on the controls. So I have an example here in the viewport. This is a very basic setup, it is not a complete rig, but it will give an idea of how this will work. I'll select the thigh of the character. I should be able to rotate and pose the thigh now. The skeleton here is set up more for deformation than animation, so I do have a couple of extra joints here, but I am able to manipulate the leg of the character using FK controls. Essentially, we are able to pose the character by selecting the character in the viewport, where all the selections are made by pointing directly onto the mesh of the character, and there are no controls visible within the viewport. In this case, I'm not actually selecting the mesh directly. This is all constructed using controls. It's just that the controls will not be visible within the viewport. This is incredibly easy to set up, and it generally works best with FK controls. This current setup is working with the standard KineFX controls, but this will also work with Apex. Although Apex has some minor drawbacks with this setup, as Apex does highlight the controls, so the setup wouldn't be as invisible as you'd have with a standard KineFX rig. But it is a very nice way to work in the viewport. It is also extremely straightforward to set up, as the hardest part is actually the creation of the control geometry. This process doesn't really change much from standard control geometry. It is also something which we can do procedurally, although I will not cover that in this video. So now I can look at how we can create these controls, and I'm going to begin with the basic KineFX rig. As I've said previously, this setup is extremely basic. Houdini, however, can be obscure at times, and this is one of the places where that obscurity is the main form of difficulty. This is an extremely basic example rig. This is essentially a deformed cylinder, and this is set up with a skeleton which has 3 joints, which essentially function as 2 bones. Here I'm going to create a very basic setup, and I'm going to base this setup off the original geometry. The original geometry is a tube which is facing down the x-axis, and this tube has been shifted down the x-axis by half its height. This means that the base of the tube is at the center of the world, and this is pointing down the x-axis. I'm going to duplicate this tube to create the controls, and in this case I'm going to be creating 2 separate controls. The controls will require a name, and the name will be a primitive attribute. The control name should be unique. In this case, however, the names will be reasonably arbitrary, and I'll name the first Tube 1, and the second control will have the name Tube 2. To make these controls easier to identify, I'm going to give them a color. I'll give the first control a reddish color, and the second control will have a green color. I can resize these controls. Both of these controls will need to have their height halved, and currently they have the height of 1, so the final height will be 0.5. The second control is not currently placed correctly. This control should be placed along the tube, so I need to shift this along the x-axis. So in the expression for the x-axis, I'm going to add the height to the current offset. The height here will also be halved. I now have 2 controls, and I can merge these controls together. These controls can now be used within the character, and to do this I'll use an attached joint geonode. I'll connect this to the rig. I'm going to connect this to the animation branch of the rig. This is setting the third input of the joint capture biharmonic node, as well as the third input of the bone deform node. The first port of the joint capture biharmonic node is set by a skeleton. The second port will be set by the controls which we have created. I can now add controls to the skeleton, and there will be 2 assignments here. I'll assign this to the first joint first, which will be joint 0. The control here will be the tube. The second control will be attached to point 1, and this will have the shape tube 2 attached to it. When I attach the second control, we will have an issue, and that's that the control will be shifted in world space. The assumption is made by default that the controls will be placed at the center of the world, and the control will then be shifted relative to the joint. So the control doesn't maintain its original space within the world. It is very straightforward to prevent this shift from happening. To do this, we'll activate the option Keep World Transforms. This setup is something which we cannot actually do when using Apex, as the default control configuration within Apex does not have the world settings. That, however, is not an issue, as we can create standard KineFX controls like this, and then apply those controls to an Apex rig. I do now have the controls, but this is not of much use. I can use these controls within the viewport, but these controls are still visible, and we will still be able to see them in the viewport. So in the final rig we still see the controls, but we have Z fighting between the controls and the mesh. So we'll now want to do something to make these controls transparent, and there are a number of ways in which I can do this. First, I'll create this using an attribute create node, and we're going to create an attribute to control transparency within the viewport. This is one of those things which you would think would be reasonably obvious, and you would think that there would be a transparency node to do this. However, there isn't actually any obvious way of doing this. This is simple enough to do, but it is a bit obscure, especially if you're new to Houdini and are not familiar with the default attributes. The attribute that we're going to use to add transparency to the geometry is called alpha, and this must be spelt with a capital A. This is a float attribute and it is a point attribute. I'll connect the create attribute node to the controls, and then I can update the value of the attribute, and I should now be able to control the transparency of the controls within the viewport. I'm not going to be using the attribute create node. Instead, I'm going to use an attribute wrangle node, as this is more concise, and I think that it provides a simpler interface. I'll specify that this is a float attribute, so this will be f at. The name of the attribute is alpha, and this is spelled with a capital A. I'm going to set this with the float parameter using the chf function, and I'll call this parameter transparency. I'll add this to the interface, and I should now have a straightforward control which will be limited between 0 and 1. I've now updated my controls, but when I try and manipulate the rig, I still see the skeleton, and I also have points to represent the joints for the rig. To get rid of these, I'm going to update the rig pose node, and here I'll work in the settings tab. I'll add a configuration here. By default, the configuration will work on all of the joints, so I do not need to update the group. Here I'm going to turn off the display of the joints, as well as the display of the polygon lines. The packed geometry is the geometry for the controls. We need to keep this active. If this is turned off, we will not be able to select the controls. This actually gives us two ways to control the visibility, where the alpha transparency will make the controls invisible, but will still allow us to select the controls within the viewport, and the visibility will hide the controls and turn off selection. This gives us a lot of flexibility when setting up rigging controls, and this is actually an extremely powerful feature. In the viewport, I should now be able to manipulate the mesh. I no longer will be able to see the controls, and it'll give me selections based on controls which are very near to the mesh geometry. Because of this, it's very easy to match the selection to the mesh. The quality of the controls will affect the selection here. There are numerous ways of generating controls based off the geometry. Some of these can be done with the default nodes within Houdini, and can give you a very basic quick setup. We can also construct systems which will give us very good control over generated geometry, and this will basically depend on what your needs are. So this control setup which I've just created can be used for Apex as well. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to use it within an Apex network. Here I have a basic Apex setup, and I'm going to paste the controls here. I will not be using these controls yet, however, as I want to work with the default Apex controls first. I am, however, going to duplicate the controls for the first tube, as this will be the basis for the Apex controls as well. I will give this control a blue color. The default way to do this within Apex would be to use an Apex configure controls node. This node will be connected at the end of the network. This network is set up with two auto rig nodes. The first of these is creating FK controls, and the second of these is creating the bone deformation. The first port will be connected to the Apex rig, and the second port will be set by the control geometry. Within the configure controls node, I'm going to add two control configurations. I will also want to make sure that the rig source and the guide source are specified correctly. These usually are specified correctly by default. I can then specify the joints within the skeleton. The first is going to be point 0. I'll then use a shape override, and this should allow me to specify tube 1 as the control. This control will automatically be offset based off its local position, so it will be shifted to the position of the point, and here we have no options to use the world position for the control. So for the second joint, I'm going to use the same control that I used for the first. This joint will be point 1, and once again I'm going to be using the tube control. So I now have two controls, and we can use these within the animate state, and once again the controls are visible within the viewport, and we have Z fighting between the controls and the mesh. I can, however, do exactly the same thing with the controls which I've done previously. So I can duplicate the attribute wrangle node, and I can add the alpha attribute to these controls as well. In the animate node, I will now have transparent controls, and the selection will work in exactly the same way. Unlike the standard KineFX posing, the Apex posing will highlight the controls, and unfortunately at the moment you cannot turn off this display. There are various settings which we can use within the Apex view state, however turning off this display is not one of them. However, we can now still select the controls within the viewport without the controls being visible. As I said previously, we do not necessarily need to use this setup. We can use the KineFX control setup, which will give us a little bit more control than the Apex control setup does. So I'll duplicate the Apex network. These will be the two auto rigger nodes which are creating the FK transforms, as well as the bone deform. I can then attach the control setup to my skeleton. This will be done before we create the packed geometry for the Apex network, so it is exactly the same setup which we'd have for a standard KineFX rig. I am missing a wrist transform attribute, so I'll add this with the rig stashed pose node. This will add the controls to the geometry, and I now need to attach them to the Apex rig. I'll do this at the end of the rig by attaching another Apex auto rig node. Here I'll set the component to configure controls. This node will usually give me a warning, and we cannot really update this warning, so we can ignore it. We should, however, now have exactly the same control setup, only these controls were created in world space and not in local space. So this is how we can make our controls transparent. These can apply to any controls which we make, whether they're standard control items or whether they're geometry generated from the mesh. This will give us a lot of flexibility, it can make our rigs simpler to work with, and it can make the rigs easier to animate.